Good evening. I'd like to welcome you tonight to this Erasmus lecture. I'm Greg Spencer. I'm a member of the Communication Studies Department at Westmont College. We are privileged tonight to have Kelley Nikondeha. Okay, I did all right? Okay, so Kelley is a Westmont grad of 1991, and she also has an MDiv from Fuller Seminary. She is a co-director of an organization called Communities of Hope, which is a community development program in Burundi, Africa. So you might be thinking, why Burundi? A very small country in East Africa, thank you, near Rwanda.
Yes.
Right? Okay. She married a Burundian, and that took her to Burundi, and his name is Claude, very fine man, met him. And she also is a kind of theologian-in-residence at SheLoves Magazine, so you can go online and discover that. She writes regularly for that magazine, a magazine that is committed to global issues of love and justice, especially for women. And these are her credentials, but I think of Kelley almost once a week. So Kelley, 26 years ago, gave me this green mug. And I have a cup of coffee in this mug about once a week, and I think about Kelley when I have, not every week, but sometimes I do. And I remember our many conversations as student and professor, walking across campus, or sometimes in my office, or conversations we had in class. And I remember Kelley so well as someone so hungry to know. I mean, she just wanted to know. Sometimes we might talk of this as the will to omniscience. Maybe that's a little overstated, but Kelley wanted to know all things theological, spiritual, and rhetorical. And so she has continued to mature in all of these areas. And as a Communication Studies Department, we are very proud of her. She has recently published a book, which I should have with me. Thank you, my assistant, my lovely assistant over here, Janet. So this is her book, which is called Adopted, the Sacrament of Belonging in a Fractured World. So I've been reading this book, and she's a very good writer, which, again, makes us proud. So please welcome Kelley Nikondeha.
Well, good evening. It's an honor to stand in front of you here in Hieronymus Lounge. You know that I'm an alum because I can say it rolls off the tongue. But it's an honor to be among esteemed students and lifelong learners, which I hope we all are. I never thought when I graduated from Westmont 26 years ago that I would again be standing and speaking in front of Dr. Spencer. I thought those days were over. It was a failure of imagination on my part. And I'm so grateful that you facilitated this invitation, among others in this room. And so it's an honor to share a bit of my story with you tonight. I am not here tonight, though, because I'm an alum or because I was a student of Greg Spencer. I'm here because I'm a tenured member in the company of the adopted. So before I was a student, or before I decided I was going to be a comm major, I was adopted 48 years ago. My parents brought me home from an adoption agency in Los Angeles, a domestic adoption. It would be many years later that I brought my two babies home from Burundi, as we said, a country in East Africa, and they came to me through international adoption. And so my story, my whole experience of family really, is bookended by adoption. So you can see why this would be a significant word in my vocabulary. About 6 years ago, I noticed that there was an explosion of conversation about adoption. Now, talking about adoption is nothing new to me. As I said, 40-some years this has been my vernacular. But I noticed, and maybe it was because there was more blogging, and so there was more venues for people to be sharing their stories, particularly women talking about adoption, how they adopted their babies, inspirational tips, kind of how to adopt. They were sharing their stories. But at the same time, there were a number of books that were being published about the theology of adoption. Most of them were written by men. Make what you will of that. But as I read the blogs and started to read the books, none of what they said, maybe that's an overstatement, not much of what they said, resonated with my own language or life as an adopted person. And this was when, you might call it a moment of exigence, when I decided that maybe this was my invitation to contribute to the conversation, that maybe from my years of being adopted, and by this time years of being an adopted mom, that I had something I could contribute to this conversation. I thought, as a woman, as a mother, as an adopted person, maybe I had something to offer. And so my hope was to bring together the stories and experiences of adoption I had grown up with, as well as the metaphors of adoption and the pictures of adoption that we see in Scripture, and bring those together and do some theological reflection. I wish that there were more women doing it, and I hope I'm only the first of many others who will step in and follow. So first, a word about language. I wanted to craft a language about adoption that was true to my experience, accessible to other people, and sacramental, meaning something that I could break open and that we could share, and maybe it would convey grace between us. So I had two primary influences. Nobody should be surprised who one of them is. For many years now, I have subscribed to the Spencer standard, loving appropriately through speech. If I was going to write and reflect on adoption, I wanted it to be a deep expression of loving appropriately through speech. And theologically, my influence was Walter Brueggemann, wonderful Old Testament scholar. And he talks about his work as a communicator, as a preacher, and as a Bible teacher, that what he does more than anything else is play with language. That what he wants is to find that one right word or phrase that describes what he's seeing in the text and breaks it open for the imagination of the hearer or the reader. And so that was my hope, that if I could do this labor of love, that my language would be loving and that it would be imaginative. So that's where I began. So I want to tell you a story tonight. It's late, it's cool outside, good time for storytelling. Should have had the fireplace going tonight. When I was a little girl, sitting in Sunday school, the story that most resonated with me was the story of Moses. He was let go of by one woman, and he was received by another. Very familiar gestures to me as an adopted child. So there was a connection between Moses and I. When I decided to really work on the language of adoption, this is where I started. Back at the edge of the Nile, the story of Moses. So I will tell the story through the lens of an adopted person tonight. There were some hard times in Egypt. Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. He didn't remember the Hebrews and why they came and what they contributed. Pharaoh didn't remember. All he knew is that these people, these Hebrew people who were very fertile and were very strong and kept growing, he saw them as a threat. They were a threat to him and his fellow Egyptians. And so he spent time thinking, how am I going to curb the fruitfulness of these people? First, he tried to work with the midwives, 2 Hebrew midwives, to see if he could get them to do a covert operation. And if you know the story, you know that that didn't work. Because we're told that these women didn't see the way Pharaoh saw. They didn't see in order to discern if it was a boy or a girl. These women loved God, and so they saw the way God saw. They didn't distinguish. And so they didn't participate in Pharaoh's plan. And so instead, he had to enlist more people. And the story says that kind of Pharaoh got all the Egyptians in on it so that in a sense they all became somehow complicit. When you see a Hebrew baby boy, plunge him under the waters of the Nile. Don't worry about the girls. Let them live. Pharaoh always underestimates the women. It was so then and it is so now. But we still have this situation, right? Perilous times in the brickyards of Egypt. And yet we hear of a woman. Her name is Jochebed. And Jochebed marries, conceives, and has a child. For 9 months, she didn't know, boy or a girl. Will this child live or will this child die? The baby is born, and it is a baby boy. And the story says that when she held her son, she saw that he was tov, good. This is a very heavy word. In Genesis, we hear that God created, and on the end of the first day, it was tov, and at the end of the second day, it was tov, and at the end of the third day, it was tov, it was good. And so Jochebed looks at her baby boy and she says, all of creation goodness, I see it in my son. And so she hid him as long as she could, probably nursed him, probably sang him, I think, liberation lullabies as long as she could, until his lungs were too robust and she couldn't hide him any longer. So then what do? You've got Pharaoh's men breathing down your neck. You've got all of Egypt conspiring against your little son. What do? Do you risk the fact that your baby boy might be killed by one of Pharaoh's men? Or do you decide the last face he will see will be mine? It will be a face of love. Well, we hear that Jochebed ends up going down to the edge of the Nile. And she, I guess, decides the face of love is going to be the last thing my son sees. Except that by the time she gets down to the Nile, something has changed. Did she plan it? Was it spontaneous? We don't know. But by the time she gets there, she starts constructing a raft or an ark made of reeds so that he can survive the flood. And so she places her son, full of creation goodness. She stewards the ultimate creation that God has given her, and she puts him in and sends him across the Nile. I wonder if she just wasn't daring God. See the creation goodness in him like I do and save him. Now, Jochebed is a picture of a birth mother. But in my thinking, she is not a monster. She didn't abandon her son. She didn't reject her son. She relinquished her son because in that moment, the most loving thing she could do was to give him a chance. She made a terribly hard choice to relinquish, when the injustice of an empire was breathing down her neck. Yes? It's often the case with birth mothers. Not always, but often. That injustice creates conditions where birth mothers, birth fathers have to make really difficult decisions. And all of a sudden, love looks like relinquishment, which is a surprise to most of us. On the other side of the river, there's another woman. Jewish tradition gives us her name, Bethia. Bethia is one of Pharaoh's daughters, probably one of many. He might not have even known all the names for all the daughters that he had. But Jewish tradition helps us at least imagine that somehow Bethia wasn't satisfied with her father's edict. There was some dissatisfaction, and one of the ways they saw that was that she would come down to the edge of the river, not necessarily for hygiene purposes. Our Jewish friends say that she came down for more of a ritual cleansing. She was wanting to clean her soul. So she comes down one morning and she dips into the water. And often, a little ways out, she can see there are some reeds that are shaking. And she hears a baby cry. Now, this would not have been the first time that Bethia had seen a baby make his way up to the shore. How many of you here tonight can imagine a little boy in a red t-shirt, face down in the sand on the shore of the Mediterranean? We have seen these boys before. This wasn't the first time that Bethia saw a baby on the shore. But they were always dead by the time she saw them, right? What could she do? Sure, I'm a woman of privilege, I'm Pharaoh's daughter, but what can I do? I'm paralyzed. I can't convince my dad, he didn't even know my name probably, I can't convince him to stop killing babies. She felt helpless, even in her privilege, as she saw babies dying. But this day, the reeds moved and the baby cried, and what she knew was that this baby was alive, right? So she was ready to do something. She may not have gone down that morning and said, I'm going to go down and save a child. I'm going to go down and step into, the justice narrative happening in the Nile. And yet she was ready because she was so dissatisfied with what was happening that when the moment presented herself, when that baby boy made it known that he was alive, she was there, had him in her arms. And she had just stepped into a justice story. Because see, the water of the Nile, if we look into our Hebrew understanding, waters were often dangerous places, chaotic places. And I would say, in this story, it kind of represents the injustice between the two different sides of the empire, yes? On one side, the Hebrew women, the other side, women of privilege like Bethia. And from their various sides, they step into the dangerous, chaotic waters of injustice and decide they are going to save. They are going to work together to bring about liberation for this one boy. Does that make sense? I get carried away when I tell this story, so. Now, years later, we will see Moses as an adult. We will see him struggle with his own identity as an adopted person. I'm Hebrew. I care about the Hebrew people. When they are being hurt, I want to jump in. I'm so angry. I will raise my hand and you know the rest. But when he flees out to the desert, the women who see him say, oh, there's the Egyptian. On the inside, Hebrew. The outside looks like an everyday Egyptian. Dual nature. You know, his mother gave him a name. His adoptive mother gave him a name. Moses. The Egyptians would have heard that and thought, oh, son. In case anybody wondered, his name is Son. But when the Hebrew women heard the name, Moses means drawn out. Bethia gave him a name that worked in both cultures. My husband has done the same with our children. They have names that function in two different linguistic worlds. I think that Bethia, as an adoptive mom, wanted her son to be able to know both of his stories, both of his identities. And what we see in the burning bush, I think, in part, is that God empowers the fullness of Moses' identity. Can you imagine Moses not knowing that he was Hebrew? Don't you think the story might have turned out different? But because he was both Hebrew and Egyptian, God was able to empower both of those identities. And he stepped into the liberation story. I also think it helped that he had some pretty amazing mothers and women around him who gave him a great picture of what it could be to be part of a liberation story. But that's for another time. So catch your breath. It's a good story. This story has really been helpful for my son. So let me tell you a little bit about Justin. Justin was found wrapped in an African fabric by the side of a road in a very poor community. Oh, he was probably only days old because he still had his umbilical cord attached. He was found by a farmer on their way to market one morning. Our best guess is that Justin was an orphan of extreme poverty. Most likely, his mother didn't think she could continue feeding and caring for him once he was born. Right? So when I talk to my son, he's now 13 and a half, but we've been telling this story since he was about 3 or 4, every time adding a little bit more. And at one point he realized, wait a minute, you mean my mom might have been like Jochebed? She loved me, but she just couldn't keep me. He got it. And I said, that's right. And we talked about what kind of injustice, what kind of hard things might your mother have been struggling with? What things might she have been afraid of? So that putting you by the road was the most loving thing she could do that day. So in Burundi, your skirt, it's called an igitange, is often the most expensive thing you have in your wardrobe, maybe even in your house, if you're a woman who's living in extreme poverty. So here's this woman who takes, probably most of the time it's what you get on your wedding day. So here she takes a wedding gift, the most expensive thing she has in her house, also the most colorful thing she has. She wraps it around this little baby boy, and she puts him by the side of the road where she knew who comes by. This is her neighborhood. She knew who was going to be coming by. She was not so careless. She placed her son by the side of the road so that he would be found. Right? Sounds so much like Jochebed. And I remember at one point when my son was old enough, he's like, wait a minute, Mom. She prayed for somebody to take care of me, and God sent you. That feels really good as an adoptive mom. I won't lie, to hear your son make the observation that you are connected to his mom. But this story has helped him understand some things about his birth mom, some things about himself, and some things about me that I think have been very helpful. So, I just want to make it pretty clear what we have learned from this story, because we're talking about language. This story has helped my family because we can speak honestly about our birth mothers and the challenges that impinged upon them, right? We can talk about extreme poverty, food insecurity, lack of medicine, fear that they won't be able to send their kid to school, that they won't be able to pay for his books or his shoes. We can talk about that and understand that these were legitimate fears that his mom had. It also allows us to talk about his mother as a victim of these huge systemic things, not as a villain. Every kid wants to be able to love their mom. I want my son to be able to love his mom too. I think she did the very best she could under some really hard circumstances. So here's some language that helps us. We talk about both mothers. So my mom taught me that there was a birth mom, and then there was her, which she still gave me both, but you could tell there was a bit of a difference. I know a lot of people in the adoption community talk about your first mom and your second mom. That works. I just say you have two moms, and you get us both. You don't have to choose. You don't have to have a favorite. You can love us both. You can get frustrated with us both, but God has given you both to make sure that you are able to belong and grow and flourish. So that has helped us because my kids don't have to choose. They can love us both. We talk about this language has helped us talk about the connection between relinquishment and injustice. Now, this is not the story for every adoption. I always like to make very clear that adoption is not monolithic. It isn't a single story. There are a lot of different ways that adoption happens, a lot of ways it can go sideways, a lot of ways that it can break open God's goodness. But more often than not, I have found when a woman has to relinquish her child, there is some kind of injustice, often generational injustices, or a whole catalog of them that impinge upon the shoulders of this woman and her family. More often than not, you don't give away your child carelessly. It is an act of love under very extreme circumstances. And so it helps us to be able to talk about that injustice. It helps my son to think about, so she did love me, but there were these hard things. And he already talks about, well, how can I help so that other mamas don't have to make the same choice? He's already getting, at 13, a vocabulary for how do we push against these kind of injustices so other women don't have to make that same hard choice. And other little boys don't have to be without one of their mamas, their first mama, however you would like to say it. It also allows us, I think, as an adoptive mom, it allows me to have more empathy for the birth mom. Sometimes that's in short supply when we talk about these women. But this story helps me have some empathy for things that she has had to face and choices she has had to face that are different from my own. It allows me to talk about partnership with these women. So I have 2 children. Each of them have different stories about being relinquished. I told you my son was relinquished due to extreme poverty, my daughter due to HIV/AIDS. Both her parents have the disease. She was born testing positive for the disease. Another whole set of injustices. Lack of health care, lack of food, lack of everything that she needed to be able to fight that, right? So I have these 2 beautiful babies and 2 different mothers. But this story has given me language to say, I am a partner with these 2 women. I move in fidelity with these 2 mothers. I am not their adversary. I do not have to be scared or threatened by them or their presence in our story. We are working different sides of the river, but we both want that baby boy, we both want that baby girl to live. And so we often talk about how our mamas, my kids do, how my mamas work together. Some mamas get to birth their babies, and some mothers have to raise the babies. Some mothers get to do both. But, it gives us that language that we're doing this together, we're collaborating. And for me as a mom, it helps me. I don't have to be scared of these women. I am their partner. I am finishing what they started. And I want to be faithful to raise these children with every hope that they had for them. I am just their partner in the story. I think that's helpful for us as adoptive moms. And finally, this story has helped me to recognize that God empowers our full story. As an adopted daughter, I'm glad every part of my story is available for God to empower and use. My son and daughter are both Burundian and American. Now, I am not going to tie their hand behind the back and say you can only function in this world as an American. I want them to have the fullness of being both and see how God is going to empower them as Burundians and as Americans. What will that look like? I have no idea, but it is going to be an adventure to see. I'm hoping they step into some liberation stories. I'm hoping they follow in their father's footsteps, and they want to deal with malnourishment, and they want to deal with health care, and they want to deal with Jubilee economics. I hope that they follow in his footsteps. I hope they're liberators, revolutionaries. It would do my heart good. But however they're going to grow to be, I want God to have all of them in order to work and empower, right? Isn't that what we want for our families, for each other? This list is not exhaustive, but I hope it gives you a start, that when we look at some of these stories in Scripture, we can start to see things and name things and work to find language. This is how I do my theological reflection anyways. So I'll give you 2 quick notes, and then you want to do some Q&A. So Jesus was biological son of Mary, yes? Adopted son of Joseph, making Jesus the adopted one. I love that I have in common with Jesus that adoption story. And there's much I could tell you, but I will tell you this one thing. I think it was much easier for Jesus to stand in front of his hometown and look them in the eyes and say, any of you could be my mother, could be my brother, could be my sister. Right? In God's wide, generous family, any one of you could be mine. I think he was able to say that because of Joseph, because his adopted father taught him every day that anybody can be your family if you let them. We hear Paul talk about adoption. He writes about it in Romans and Ephesians, and in Romans, Ephesians, Galatians. Now, I want to point out a little bit of an anachronism. When Paul first mentioned the word adoption, the first thing his listeners would have heard or would have read if they were the ones reading the letter wasn't about orphans and babies in need of nurture and care. The first thing they would have thought of is the empire, right? You look like you need me to help you out a little. Did you know that Julius Caesar didn't have a son to inherit the Roman Empire? So he adopted Augustus. But Augustus was a full-grown man. He was a military man. He was a general. He had won many campaigns for Julius Caesar. So why do you need to adopt a full-grown general? Because if you don't have a son, you need somebody to carry on your name. You need somebody to take on the kingdom. Somebody who would inherit and rule in your stead and carry on your name, right? There are several instances of this kind of adoption in the Roman Empire. So when Paul talked about adoption, this was a function of the empire. This is how we moved and managed power. And if you read Paul's letters, every time he mentions in those epistles the word adoption, he pairs it with the word heir or inheritance, because that was the thinking. So what does that mean that we are adopted sons and daughters of God when Paul says it that way? We are functionaries of God's kingdom. We are the ones who control and manage and move God's power of love in this world. It says something about who we are as citizens in God's kingdom. But because Paul is Paul, and he always is stretching and playing with words, there also is a filial sense, a family sense to the word. So yes, when Paul says we are God's adopted children, he's also saying we are family. This is how we get into God's family. That says something about how we are connected to God. It also says how we're connected to each other. We are siblings to one another, and we ought to treat each other as siblings. Yes? So if we are all God's adopted, then the language of adoption matters to us too. That's what I hope you will consider tonight, is that the language of adoption isn't just for those like me who have that bookended experience, but all of us, as part of God's family, are adopted, and therefore these words are in our vocabulary. And we can think when we have felt orphaned, when we have had to relinquish, and why. When somebody has come and redeemed and received and welcomed us. Some of these words, these ideas of being reciprocated, or maybe unrequited reciprocity, because sometimes it's hard for us adopted kids to always reciprocate to our mom and dads. That's just the truth. But these are all things that, whether you're adopted like me or adopted the way Paul describes, these are words for us to think about belonging and the challenges to belonging as part of the same family. So I think I'm going to stop here because you want some time for Q&A. But the last word I will give you is the word sacrament. My experience of adoption is one of sacrament. See, some people will say adoption is a ministry, and that just sounds one way to me. Somebody ministering to another person. But sacrament, we are mutually being transformed. My children are a catalyst for my transformation, and I hope I am a catalyst for theirs. It is more about spiritual formation. I have been formed by adoption. Daily hospitality, welcome, acceptance, reciprocity. These are all things that have shaped who I am as a person, and I hope made me into somebody who understands and can embody belonging. So sacrament helps me understand this experience of adoption. If there are any of you in this room that are part of the company of the adopted, I hope that when you think about sacrament, you realize that you have something in your hands, not just for you and your family. You have something that you can offer to others and break open and give away. You are practitioners of belonging. You have learned day in and day out what it is to receive somebody who is not biologically yours, maybe not ethnically yours, maybe not the same culture as you, and yet every day you are together. You are practitioners of belonging. And you have something to open and share. Yes, with your family, but with your church and with your community and with a world that is hungry to know how to belong beyond the binaries, beyond the polarizations, right? If you are an adopted person, start opening that experience, because we need practitioners who can show us a better way to belong to one another. And because we are all adopted once, this language matters to us. This is how we come to God's table. This is how we come and sit with one another. We are God's adopted ones.